Hello and welcome. Today we are continuing our review of Internal Auditing Standard Series 2100. We covered already nature of work. We have covered in the last video 2110, which is regarding governance, a very important subject. And today is equally important, risk management standard 2120. So before we get off to a start, let's ask some interesting questions from this standard. And while we'll review, we'll get responses of these questions gradually. So let's start. How can Chief Audit Executive gain insight to assess whether the organization's strategic objectives support and align with its mission, vision, and risk appetite? What risk internal audit activities exposed to? How are risk management processes monitored, assessed, and evaluated? What if management has accepted the risk? If you're new to my videos, this is Tausif Mushtaq, an audit strategist, control specialist, and board advisor with over 2 decades of experience in governance, assurance, risk and controls, fraud examinations, and forensic reviews. The objective of my videos in the audit and assurance series is to promote the internal audit profession in its basic spirit, whereby the internal auditors having a clear understanding of the standards and the international professional practices framework overall, so they can contribute to achieve the mission of internal audit. The mission of internal audit is as defined by the Institute of Internal Auditors, which is to enhance and protect organizational value by providing risk-based and objective assurance, advice, and insight. The basic requirement of standard 2120 risk management is that the internal audit activity must evaluate the effectiveness of the risk management process and contribute to the improvement of risk management processes. Let's double click the requirement of this standard and understand from the interpretation more details about it. Determining whether risk management processes are effective is a judgment which results from the internal auditor's assessments that number one, organizational objectives support and align with the organization's mission, significant risks are identified and assessed, appropriate risk responses are selected that align risk with the organization's risk appetite, relevant risk information is captured and communicated in a timely manner across the organization, enabling staff, management, and the board to carry out their responsibilities. So, in order to support this assessment, the internal auditor may gather the information during multiple engagements. The results of these engagements, when viewed together, provide an understanding of the organization's risk management processes and their effectiveness. Risk management processes are monitored through ongoing management activities, separate evaluations, or both. So here the main role of Chief Audit Executive is to collectively review the overall delivery of the internal audit activity and extract from those deliverables how the overall risk management process is working. Standard 2120A1 further explains that the internal audit activity must evaluate risk exposures relating to the organization's governance, operations, and information systems regarding the achievement of the organization's strategic objectives, reliability and integrity of financial and operational information, effectiveness and efficiency of operations and programs, safeguarding of assets, which is very important area, Again, and last but not the least, is compliance with the laws, regulations, policies and procedures, and the contractual requirements. So let's have a look of few more standards within this standard, which is relating to the assurance services and relating to the consulting services. So standard 2120A2 requires that internal audit activity must evaluate the potential for the occurrence of fraud and how the organization manages fraud risk. Please keep this in mind that the prime responsibility of managing the risk of fraud is with the management. 2120C1 requires that during consulting engagements, internal auditors must address risk consistent with the engagement's objectives and be alert to the existence of other significant risk. C2 requires that the internal auditors must incorporate knowledge of risk gained from consulting engagements into their evaluation of the organization's risk management process. How does this work? That if you are performing some consulting engagements or as an advisor and you are getting some information, that information should be passed to the person or to the chief audit executive who is involved in preparing the audit plan. So that the audit plan accordingly will be adjusted after getting that feedback. C3 requires that when assisting management in establishing or improving risk management processes, internal auditors must refrain from assuming any management responsibility by actually managing risk. The implementation guide to this standard explains us how we can implement this standard by having a better understanding of the risk appetite, the business missions, and the organization objectives. It is also important to attain a complete understanding of the organization's business strategies and risk identified by management. Risk may be financial, operational, legal, regulatory, or strategic in nature. So while we are reviewing consideration for implementation, let's have a review of the definition of risk management as per the glossary of the internal auditing standards. Risk management is a process to identify, assess, manage, and control potential events or situations to provide reasonable assurance regarding the achievement of the organization's objectives. Other frameworks and models also should be considered, and internal auditors should have the knowledge of those published globally global standards which are very important, like COSO framework we discussed before, and also the implementation guide of 2100, which we have already reviewed in one of the previous couple of vlogs. So while internal audit activity will be conducting its evaluation on the effectiveness of the risk management process, the internal auditors will generally attain this understanding of the organization by having the understanding of current risk management environment and the corrective actions in place to address prior risk. It is important to know how the organizations identifies, assesses, and provides oversight for risk before internal auditors start to implement standard 2120. In its risk assessment, the internal audit activity would consider the organization's size, complexity, life cycle, maturity, stakeholder structure, and the legal and competitive environment. Recent changes in the organizational environment, for example, new regulations, new management change, new organization structure, new processes, or diversification, and the new products may have introduced the new risk to the organization. The chief audit executive may also review the maturity of the organization's risk management practices and determine to what extent the internal audit activity will rely on the management's assessment of risk. Finally, the internal audit activity should have in place an established process for planning, auditing, and reporting risk management issues, Internal auditors will also evaluate risk management during assurance and advisory reviews related to a specific area or process. So once auditor will be having the understanding of the management's risk management process and will start implementing this standard 2120. So through the implementation of this standard, the chief audit executive and the entire internal audit activity will ultimately demonstrate their understanding of the organization's risk management processes and look for opportunities for improvement. Through conversations with the senior management and the board, the chief audit executive would consider the risk appetite, risk tolerance, and risk culture of the organization. The internal audit activity should alert management to new risk as well as risk that have not been adequately mitigated and provide recommendations and action plans for an appropriate risk response. For example, maybe management can accept the risk or pursue it, transfer it, mitigate or avoid it. Additionally, the internal audit activity should obtain sufficient information to evaluate the effectiveness of the organization's risk management processes. So, how can the chief audit executive gain insight to assess whether the organization's strategic objectives support and align with its mission, vision, and risk appetite? It is by reviewing the organization's strategic plan, business plan, policies, and having discussions with the board and senior management. The chief audit executive can gain insight to assess whether the organization's strategic objectives support and align with its mission, vision, and risk appetite. So after having a review of a strategic plan, business plan, and policies, the chief audit executive should have a better understanding of all this. But there is another thing, which is the interviewing the middle management. So interviewing with the middle management may provide additional insight into the alignment of the organization's mission, objectives, and risk appetite at the business unit level. Internal auditors should thoroughly explore how the organization identifies and addresses risk and how it determines which risks are acceptable. So ultimately, internal auditor will be recording all the risk identified by the middle management as well. But definitely those risks may be somewhere in between the operational risk and maybe strategic risk. So internal audit has to assess the likelihood of an impact of those risks and accordingly handle those risks when they are, and then an internal auditor is reporting those risks to the management. Reviewing a recent exercise of risk management by the management would be handy for internal audit. The internal audit activity will typically evaluate the responsibilities and risk related processes of the board and those who are in the key risk management roles. To accomplish this, internal auditors may review recently completed risk assessments and related reports issued by senior management, external auditors, regulators, or any other sources. Additionally, the internal audit activity typically conducts its own risk assessments, discussions with the management and the board, and review of the organization's policies and minutes of the meetings. This reveals the organization's risk appetite, allowing the chief audit executive and the internal audit activity overall to align their recommended risk responses. To assist in risk identification, the internal audit activity may consider using an established risk management or control framework, for example, COSO framework or ISO 31000. How can internal audit activity remain current on potential risk exposures and opportunities? To remain current, the internal audit activity may also research new developments and trends related to the organization's industry, as well as processes that can be used to monitor, assess, and respond to such risk and opportunities. This shows again that the internal auditor needs to be involved in the sector and the business activity and get the understanding of the trends and practices of the industry, which will help him in giving better recommendations to the management. So by taking these steps, the internal audit activity or internal auditor may independently perform gap analysis to determine whether significant risks are being identified and assessed adequately, and the internal audit activity will be positioned to evaluate management's risk management process. When reviewing the risk management process, it is important for internal auditors to identify and discuss the risk and corresponding responses that have been chosen. For example, management may choose to accept risk, and the chief audit executive would need to determine whether the decision is appropriate according to the organization's risk appetite or risk management strategy. So, what if management accepts the risk? If the chief audit executive concludes that the management has accepted a level of risk that may be unacceptable to the organization, the chief audit executive must discuss the matter with the senior management and may need to communicate the matter to the board in accordance with the standard 2600, which we will review later on, which is regarding communicating the acceptance of risk. For example, if the internal auditor highlights that the current ERP does not cater for the needs of the business which we are having, or not having sufficient data in the system, and the management says that because of the limitations of ERP we will not be able to proceed further in recording the way internal auditor wants them to record, or in the way they want to record it. That does not mean that they should accept this risk, but they need to find out alternate ways of having a better data management, data recording, and retrieval of timely data, so that they can have proper decisions on the basis of the accurate data in the system. Management's risk mitigation may not be adequate. In cases where management chooses to employ a risk mitigation strategy in response to identified risk, the internal audit activity may evaluate the adequacy and timeliness of remedial actions taken if necessary. This can be achieved by reviewing the control design and testing the controls and monitoring procedures. To assess whether risk information is captured and communicated timely across the organization, internal auditors may interview staff at various levels and determine whether the organization's objectives, significant risks, and risk appetite are articulated sufficiently and understood throughout the organization. So typically the internal audit activity also evaluates the adequacy and timeliness of management's reporting of risk management results, because there is a possibility that there are some really high level of risk or which are having a high likelihood or very huge impact as well. The internal audit activity may review board minutes to determine whether the most significant risks are communicated timely to the board and whether the board is acting to ensure that management is responding appropriately. Here, one point which internal auditor should also understand is that if during the course of an audit, internal audit identifies a very high risk, and then internal auditor understands and concludes during the internal meetings that this is really a high risk with a high possibility of occurrence, then internal auditor should not wait to conclude the report, but immediately generate an alert for that there is a high risk we have identified, and now it's up to the management to address this and follow up for the implementation with your recommendations as well. So now let's see that how internal auditor actually assesses itself, what risk an internal audit activity is exposed to. Finally, the internal audit activity should take the necessary steps to ensure that it is managing its own risk. What are those risks? That can be audit failure, false assurance, and reputational risk. And likewise, all the corrective actions should be monitored. So auditor needs to know when they are starting an audit that they have a planning procedure, they are determining the scope and objective very clearly, and following up that scope with clarity, keeping themselves flexible to add or less from the scope subsequently, because when you are on the ground you find out more information, and on the basis of that you can always adjust your scope. So this is again very important area which internal auditor needs to understand and address those areas timely, so that they cannot exposed to risk of audit failure or false assurance. So the documents that make demonstrate conformance with the standard 2120 risk management is that the internal audit charter is the first document which should document the internal audit activities, roles and responsibilities related to risk management and the internal audit plan. Please keep in mind that internal audit charter also having the management responsibility of the risk management. Number 2 is conformance may be evidenced by minutes of the meetings in which the elements of the standard such as internal audit activities, risk management recommendations were discussed among the chief audit executive, the board and senior management, or meetings between the internal audit activity and relevant committees, task force and key senior management. Risk assessment performed by the internal audit activity and action plans for addressing risk generally demonstrate both the evaluation and improvement of risk management processes respectively. So concluding this, let's see what are our takeaways of today's review of standard 2120. First thing for audit function is to understand organizational objectives, business strategies, business mission, goal and risk appetite. The audit function should have knowledge of various frameworks like COSO and relevant standards. Audit function should also understand current risk management environment, management modus operandi on risk identification, organization size, nature, environment, regulatory changes and practices. All this auditor needs to know and understand. Audit functions should give appropriate recommendations and opportunities for improvement, and that is only possible once auditor is having proper and appropriate understanding of the risk environment. Assessment of risk of the strategic objective on how they are aligned with mission, vision and risk appetite. Reviewing recent risk management and related reports which assist in evaluation of the responsibilities and risk related processes. And how audit function can perform gap analysis by support of having understanding and relevant information. If risks are not accepted by management, we know that if auditor needs to assess that whether they are acceptable or unacceptable, and accordingly must discuss with the senior management and the board. And last but not the least, how we can demonstrate conformance to the standard during our external and internal assessments. So thank you so much for staying with us in this review of standard 2120 risk management. Please share my videos with other professionals, subscribe the channel, like the videos and keep supporting me so I can keep trying hard to bring those new contents to you, and which will provide benefit to the internal audit fraternity. Thank you so much.